19 million people's emergency drinking water sits behind 3 earth dams in Riverside County, inside a lake that cost $1.9 billion, built on one very specific rule. It is never allowed to touch a river. No inlet, no stream, no natural flow in or out. Officials call this the safest reservoir in California. I work in water quality, and I want to be direct. Cutting a lake off from a river doesn't make the water simple. It just moves the risk somewhere quieter. Right now, 260 feet down, that quieter risk turns green every summer. Okay, let me back up because the official version of this story is clean, and clean is exactly the problem. I deal with reservoirs and lake management for a living, and I want to say something up front so you know where I'm coming from. I am not shocked that a deep, still, closed lake in Southern California grows algae in the summer. That part doesn't surprise me at all. What frustrates me is how this story gets told publicly, like the engineering choice alone settled the water quality question forever. It didn't. It just moved the question somewhere less visible. Diamond Valley Lake, built by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, out near Hemet, $1.9 billion, construction running from 1995 to 2003. 3 earth-filled dams, some pushing 300 feet tall, one of them a mile and a half long. They moved 110 million cubic yards of earth to make this basin. That is not a small project. That is one of the largest earthworks jobs in American history, and they did it to build something that, on paper, sounds almost boring. A hole in the ground to hold water. Except it's not just a hole. It holds 800,000 acre-feet, 260 billion gallons. It's the backbone of the emergency water supply for 19 million people across 6 counties. If the aqueducts ever go down, earthquake, drought, infrastructure failure, whatever, this lake is the 6-month cushion that keeps Southern California from a genuine crisis. And the site wasn't picked at random either. MWD chose this valley because it sits roughly between Los Angeles and San Diego, because the surrounding hills happen to have the right raw material on hand to build 3 earth-filled dams without trucking fill in from somewhere else, and because the elevation allowed gravity flow and even some hydroelectric potential on the way out. That's smart engineering. I'm not disputing that. But notice what's on that list of reasons and what isn't. Water quality management isn't the reason they picked this valley. Water quality management is what they had to build on top of the valley afterward. And here's the detail that gets buried under all the engineering talk. This lake has no river. None. It is what's called an off-stream reservoir, which means the valley they flooded had no permanent stream running through it worth connecting. Every drop of water in Diamond Valley Lake got there through a pipe. The Colorado River Aqueduct, the State Water Project, coming down through the inland feeder. They filled a lake the size of 4,500 acres using plumbing. I want to be fair here, because this was not an accident, and it was not incompetence. It was a deliberate engineering choice, and on its own terms, it's a good one. No river means no sediment load. No river means no agricultural runoff sneaking in every spring. No river means no flood pulse dumping a surprise slug of turbid, contaminated water into your drinking supply the week you least expect it. If you're designing a reservoir purely to avoid the classic contamination pathway, water moving downhill through farmland and development before it reaches your intake, you engineer out the river. That's the sales pitch. That's the headline. That's what makes this the safest lake in the system. Here's where I start getting annoyed with how this story gets told, because the sales pitch stops at the design phase. Nobody wants to talk about what happens after you seal a lake off from moving water. A river does something people don't think about, because it's not glamorous. It flushes. It brings in new water. It carries old water out. It disturbs the bottom. It keeps things from settling into permanent patterns. Cut that off, and what you're left with is a closed system. A 250 million gallon container that never naturally resets itself. Every bit of water quality management that a river would have done for free now has to be done by a human being on a schedule, forever. That's not a footnote. That's the actual trade you made. You didn't eliminate the risk of managing this water. You just signed up to manage it manually for the entire life of the reservoir. And the entire life of the reservoir is not a short commitment. This lake was designed to serve for generations. Every water quality manager who ever works here, every board member who ever approves a budget line for it, every inspector who ever checks a boat trailer at the gate, is inheriting a system that was built to need them indefinitely. A river-fed lake gets some of its water quality management for free, built into the hydrology. This one gets none of that for free. Every bit of it has to be paid for, staffed, scheduled, and defended, year after year, by an institution that also has budget cycles, staffing turnover, and competing priorities. That's the quiet bill nobody put on the original $1.9 billion price tag. Now let's talk about the physical shape of the thing, because the shape is doing more work in this story than most people realize. 260 feet at its deepest point, 4,500 acres of surface. That's a deep, large body of still water sitting out in the inland Empire Sun for months at a time. Here's why depth like that matters, and I promise this isn't trivia. In summer, the top layer of a lake this size heats up fast, because sunlight only penetrates so far, and shallow, exposed surface water absorbs heat quickly. Down below, 200 feet of water stays cold and dense and largely undisturbed. You end up with two separate layers that don't mix, a warm cap floating on top of a cold, still reserve. That's called stratification, and it happens in reservoirs all over the world. It's not exotic. What matters is what stratification does to a body of water that has no river to stir it back together. In a river-fed lake, incoming flow and seasonal turnover do some of this work for you. Cold water pushes in, warm water gets displaced, the layers get disrupted a few times a year, whether anyone's watching or not. Diamond Valley doesn't get that for free. Whatever mixing happens here has to happen through wind, through temperature swings, through the water district's own operations moving water in and out through the pipes. Right there. That's the detail that matters. It's not that stratification is unusual. It's that this particular lake has fewer natural forces working to break it up than a river-fed lake would. Warm, sunlit, still water sitting for weeks on end is close to a perfect setup for algae. Doesn't matter how clean the water was when it arrived through the aqueduct. Doesn't matter that there's no farm runoff feeding it nutrients directly. Birds land on it, dust settles into it, recreational users bring in whatever's on their gear. Small nutrient inputs over months in warm, undisturbed water add up. And current fishing reports out of Diamond Valley describe exactly what you'd expect from that setup. Recurring algae, reduced water clarity, especially as the water climbs into the high 60s and 70s through the season. That's not a scandal by itself. That's physics doing what physics does. The lake did exactly what a deep, sunlit, closed body of water is supposed to do when you give it heat and time. But here's the first real reversal, and it's the one that made me want to talk about this case specifically. The whole justification for cutting out the river was contamination control. Stop the bad stuff from getting in. And it turns out the actual contamination threat that MWD spends real operational effort defending against didn't come from a river at all. It came from boats. Quagga mussels are established through the Colorado River system, Lake Mead, Lake Havasu, Lake Mojave, all confirmed. These things are a nightmare for infrastructure. They multiply fast, they clog intake pipes and pumping equipment, and once they're established, they restructure the whole biology of a lake, which can trigger exactly the kind of algae shifts we're talking about. Here's the mechanism, and it's a strange one. These mussels filter enormous volumes of water, which can actually knock down certain types of algae while giving other, sometimes more troublesome species room to take over. So it's not a simple story of mussels bad, more algae. It's a story of one invasive species rewriting which organisms win and lose in a lake's ecosystem, in ways that aren't fully predictable in advance. Diamond Valley Lake does not have them, not found there. But MWD runs a mandatory boat inspection and decontamination program specifically because recreational boats and trailers are the transmission vector that actually matters, not the river, the trailer hitch. Sit with that for a second. They engineered an entire multi-billion-dollar reservoir around blocking a contamination pathway that was never really the primary threat to begin with, and then had to build a separate human inspection system to guard against the pathway that actually is the threat. The lake was never allowed to touch a river. It's allowed to be touched by every boat that gets past inspection. I'm not saying that's a design failure. Boat vector risk exists everywhere, river or no river. What I am saying is that we remove the river, so we remove the risk framing doesn't hold up once you look at what MWD is actually spending resources monitoring. The lake's real vulnerability was never hydrological. It's behavioral. It's people. And I want to be clear that this is not a lake sitting off in isolation while the district ignores it. MWD's board approved a contract in January of 2023 worth $14.8 million to a contractor to build a bypass pipeline off Diamond Valley's Wadsworth pumping plant, part of a larger project to move water from this reservoir out toward communities that got hit hardest during the last drought. Money is actively flowing into the system, constantly. That's not the accusation here. The accusation, if you want to call it that, is narrower. A lot of that spending is aimed at moving water and protecting delivery infrastructure, and comparatively little of the public-facing information is aimed at proving, on paper, that the water sitting in that basin all summer is being watched the way a closed system this important deserves. Which brings me to the part of this story that I think is genuinely underreported, and it's not glamorous, but it's the real accountability thread here. This reservoir has two jobs that quietly compete with each other. Job 1, hold drinking water for 19 million people. Job 2, function as a public recreation destination, boating, fishing, hiking, all of it, actively promoted by the district. MWD's own planning documents acknowledge this tension directly. They note that increased recreational, body contact use can constrain the district's ability to manage water quality, specifically because algae treatment using copper sulfate can conflict with public swimming and boating access. Read that again, because it's doing a lot of quiet work. The standard tool for knocking down an algae bloom is a chemical treatment that isn't supposed to be applied while people are actively in the water. So the timing of when you're allowed to treat a bloom isn't purely dictated by the biology of the bloom. It's dictated, at least in part, by the recreation calendar. That's not corruption. Nobody's hiding a smoking gun here. But it is a structural conflict. And structural conflicts are exactly the kind of thing that turns a manageable problem into a recurring one. Because the treatment schedule isn't chasing the algae. It's negotiating around the weekend. And copper sulfate itself, I want to be precise about what this actually does, because people assume a treatment means a solution. It doesn't. Copper sulfate is a legitimate decades-old tool. It ruptures algae cells and knocks down a visible bloom fast. That's it. That's the whole job. It does not touch the underlying condition that produced the bloom in the first place. The depth, the stagnation, the heat, the slow nutrient creep from birds and dust and runoff inside the surrounding reserve. You can green the water down to blue in a weekend and still have every single structural condition that produced the algae sitting there unchanged, waiting for the next warm stretch. That's not a fix. That's a short-term knockdown with a recurring invoice. And I want to be precise about the technology fit question here too, because it's easy to slide into saying copper sulfate is a bad choice, and that's not accurate. Copper sulfate has been used to manage algae in reservoirs for a very long time, and in the right conditions, at the right dose, applied at the right point in a bloom's life cycle, it works exactly as intended. The question isn't whether the tool is legitimate. The question is whether the tool is being applied on a schedule that matches the biology, or on a schedule that matches everything except the biology. The marina calendar, staffing, weekend crowds. A legitimate treatment applied at the wrong time, for reasons that have nothing to do with the algae itself, stops being a water quality decision and starts being a scheduling decision that happens to involve water. Here's where I'd start asking annoying questions if I were sitting across the table from someone at this district. What does the actual testing record look like? Not the water clarity anecdotes from anglers, the lab data. Is there routine, publicly available cyanotoxin testing at Diamond Valley Lake? I went looking, and I could not surface a clear public record of it. I want to be careful here, because I am not telling you toxins have been found. I have no evidence of that, and I'm not going to manufacture a crisis that isn't documented. What I'm telling you is that the absence of an easily found testing record is its own kind of problem, because it means the public, and frankly, people using this lake to fish and swim, don't have a clean way to know whether the right test was run at the right time. That's the part that actually unsettles me professionally, more than a bloom itself would. A confirmed toxin gives you a number and a threshold and a plan. A missing testing record gives you nothing. It gives you a gap where certainty should be. And in water management, gaps like that don't resolve themselves quietly. They just sit there until something forces the question. Think about who's actually standing in that water. People fishing off the bank for largemouth bass and striped bass. Families out on the trails that ring the reservoir, inside a multi-species habitat reserve that was set aside specifically to protect the wildlife sharing this basin with the drinking water supply. Boaters who went through the mussel inspection line, checked their gear, did everything right, and then anchored in a cove lined with algae along the shore. None of these people are doing anything wrong. They're using a public reservoir the way the district itself markets it, as a recreation destination. The tension I mentioned earlier, treatment versus recreation, isn't abstract to them. It's the actual water they're standing in. And taxpayers funded $1.9 billion for the version of this story where none of that would be a lingering question. The sun is not going anywhere. The geese are not going anywhere. The water is going to behave like water, regardless of how carefully the concept was engineered on a blueprint 30 years ago. I want to widen the lens here for a second, because this isn't only a fish and recreation story. This lake is the emergency reserve. 6 months of supply for 19 million people sits inside a basin that stratifies every summer and grows recurring algae every warm season. Inside a system where the treatment schedule has to be negotiated against public access. That's the actual risk profile of the most expensive, most carefully engineered reservoir in the region. Not a river breach, not agricultural runoff, a management dependency that has to be executed correctly, on schedule, every single year, indefinitely, by people. Here's the uncomfortable version of that sentence. If this were a small community pond, a testing gap would be a local nuisance. This is not a small community pond. This is the emergency backstop for one of the largest urban water systems in the country, and the standard of documentation surrounding its day-to-day biological condition should reflect that scale. I'm not saying the water isn't being managed. I'm saying the public evidence that it's being managed at the level this reservoir's importance demands is thinner than the price tag would suggest. And that's the second reversal, sitting quietly underneath the first one. The entire justification for spending $1.9 billion on an off-stream design was to reduce the amount of ongoing human judgment required to keep the water safe. Get the risky natural inputs out, and the water mostly takes care of itself. Except it doesn't take care of itself. It never did. You just traded a river's-free, continuous natural flushing for a permanent, manual, judgment-based operation, inspection programs, treatment timing, recreational scheduling, testing regimes that has to be run correctly forever, with zero natural backstop if any part of that human system slips. I keep coming back to what a fully rigorous version of this would actually look like, because it's not complicated. Public, routine cyanotoxin data, published on a schedule, not just referenced in a planning document. Treatment triggers tied to bloom biology and measured thresholds, not calendar conflicts with the marina. Transparent numbers on the boat inspection program, how many vessels get decontaminated, how many get turned away, published where people can actually find them. None of that is exotic. Utilities do exactly this kind of transparent monitoring elsewhere. The gap here isn't that the tools don't exist. The gap is that what's publicly visible doesn't match the seriousness of what this reservoir is actually responsible for. I want to be fair about what rigorous actually requires here, because it's not some impossible standard. A competent, fully transparent management approach for a lake like this would tie treatment decisions to measured bloom biology and publish thresholds, not to a recreation calendar. It would publish cyanotoxin results on a regular cadence, whether the results are boring or not, specifically so the absence of a headline means something. It would publish inspection numbers for the boat program, not as a talking point, but as a running public log. None of that requires new technology. It requires deciding that transparency about a closed system is not optional just because the closed system happens to be working. So far, mostly fine. I also don't want to let this turn into a pile-on, because I want to be fair to the engineering itself. Building an off-stream reservoir at this scale, with this design, was a genuinely competent response to a real problem. River-borne contamination is a well-documented failure mode for reservoirs all over this country, and MWD avoided it. That part of the story is legitimate. What's not legitimate is letting that one engineering win stand in for the entire water quality picture, as if removing a river closes the file. It doesn't close the file. It just changes which page the risk shows up on. There's one more detail that I think about a lot with this lake, and it's almost poetic, even though I promise I'm not trying to be poetic about it. When they excavated the basin, they dug up mammoth and mastodon fossils, now on display at the Western Science Center a few miles away. Those fossils are the only genuinely natural thing that was ever in that valley. Everything else, the water, the depth, the fill schedule, the chemistry, the algae response, the boat inspections, every bit of it is a human decision, running on a human timeline, with no natural process backing it up if the humans get something wrong. So here's the thesis, and I don't think it's complicated once you strip away the press release version of this story. This was never a mysterious environmental surprise. It was the predictable output of a deep, still, closed basin sitting in the sun every summer, managed by a treatment schedule that has to compete with recreation, watched by a testing regime that isn't publicly transparent enough to reassure anyone who actually goes looking. The mistake wasn't building the lake this way. The mistake is letting we kept the river out stand in as the whole safety story, when the actual safety story is a permanent manual operation that has to be executed correctly every year with no natural process to catch a mistake if one gets made. The lake is still 260 feet deep. It still stratifies every summer, right on schedule. The second the surface water climbs past the temperature where algae stops being a possibility and starts being a certainty. It's still filled by pipes instead of a living stream, which means it will never flush itself the way a river-fed lake would. The bloom will come back next summer, the same way it came back this one, because none of the physical conditions that produce it have changed, and none of them are going to change on their own. Cutting the river out didn't make this water simple. It just made sure that the only thing standing between safe and not is whether the humans running it keep doing everything right, every single year, forever. That's not a scandal in the sense of a smoking gun cover-up. It's something quieter and, honestly, harder to fix. A permanent obligation dressed up as a permanent solution. The engineering was real. The safety was never automatic. It never was.